Okay, I think we should be live. So welcome to this live from Assumption of Physics. Today we're trying to do something different. I have with me Josh Hunt, who gave recently a presentation at an online reading group among philosophers. And he was going through some things that, quite frankly, I never quite understood. And he has an approach that sort of looks for a minimal a set of let's say, prerequisite to have a valid philosophical stance that can justify what are we doing in science. And so this really fits with what we're trying to do on the science of physics, since we're trying to find minimal sets of conditions on the physics side and on the mathematical side. So I thought we would have a conversation about this. And then I thought, well, it would be much better if we have this conversation on the channel because there might be other people that are interested in this. So I have no idea if and how many people are going to watch this. I won't be looking at the chat right now because if I look at the chat, I can't have the discussion. I'm not at the point where I can do both, and I don't have another person to go and look at the chat. So I'll just talk with Josh for like 45 minutes, and then I'll go back and see what if there are questions in the chat, and we try to make this more interactive. So. Josh, so I don't know, should I give you an introduction? You do philosophy at the University of Syracuse. Is there something you want to say about yourself, your general interest, maybe to start?
Oh, my main philosophical goal is to defend a form of empiricism where one basically respects the power of various seemingly metaphysical concepts in science like causation, explanation, counterfactuals, laws of nature. And historically, it's been difficult for people who are empiricist-minded to vindicate the use that scientists put to these concepts, largely because if you are inclined to take the concept seriously, causation, explanation, laws, etc., it seems as though you're embroiling yourself in certain kind of background metaphysical commitments of the form that an empiricist is typically not happy with. So part of the
So can you
hope.
give an example? Because like in practical way, what are the problems that you would bump into?
Oh, so we can take the case of counterfactual. So imagine I said to you, if I had totally forgotten about this Zoom talk, then I wouldn't be here right now. So that's a
Mhm.
counterfactual statement. It seems true in this context, but if you try to give truth conditions for it and take it in a very serious way, you immediately start to wonder about what's the nature of the relevant hypothetical scenario I appealed to. It's not a scenario that actually happened. I am here right now. We're talking about some hypothetical where I forgot about this talk and I didn't show up. That's not something that, occurred. So one way of taking that kind of counterfactual thinking seriously is to actually posit concrete possible worlds on which you think there is some world where my counterpart forgot about the meeting and didn't show up. And you very quickly, get committed to all kinds of seemingly extravagant metaphysical posits. If we consider a counterfactual, if donkeys were to talk, then I might find them very annoying. We're now talking about some concrete world where donkeys talk. So that's the kind of thing an empiricist would not want to be ontologically committed to. It goes
Okay.
way beyond the bounds of actuality, the bounds of sense experience. We have no causal contact with these hypothetical scenarios.
Okay. That seems reasonable. Yeah. So I interrupted you, and were you saying something else, or you?
Oh, so that's basically the kind of general problem
Mhm.
that someone who is trying to simultaneously make sense of what scientists are doing in a way that vindicates what they're doing. Like for this kind of empiricist, you view science as a paradigm of rationality. So the goal of the project is to basically give a giant thumbs up for science and think, yeah, science is doing a great job, but to give that thumbs up in a way where you're not positing substantial background metaphysical commitments up to, the various ontological posits that could ground laws of nature, that laws of nature could consist in, the various kinds of things that successful explanation could come to. Um, and the main strategy for doing that I've been developing is to take this idea from metaethics, where you have a similar kind of worry about what to do with morality. So if you're a naturalistically inclined person and you start thinking about value judgments, you very quickly get puzzled, where does value fit into the world, if at all? Our best scientific theories don't say anything about value. They don't say anything about morality, normativity, evaluative claims. So your gut reaction might be to, have a kind of skeptical attitude toward the truth of alleged moral claims. And there's a program in metaethics called Expressivism, which basically gives you a way to simultaneously preserve these naturalistic intuitions about perhaps there are no robust value facts in reality, while you're still able to vindicate our moral discourse and basically give a thumbs up to morality. It's a very effective means of coordination, for joint aims shared by rational agents. And you tell the story where you basically get to say, all of our moral thinking is true, but you vindicate it in a way where you're not embroiled in positing robust normative facts in reality. That's what expressivism lets you do in the moral context, and I'm just importing that into the scientific context
Can
for
you give an
these.
example so that I can?
Yeah, so an example in the moral context, imagine I say to you, it's very bad to not hold the door open for someone behind you. It's like morally bad behavior. You're being kind of rude if you just
Okay.
let a door slam in someone's face. And now, you're a naturalistically inclined person, and you wonder, what do you mean it's morally wrong not to hold doors open for the people behind you? Are you positing these moral wrongness facts in reality? And I say, no, 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 not necessarily. At the very least, what I'm doing is expressing acceptance of norms that forbid slamming doors on people. I'm expressing an attitude of being in favor of holding doors for people. And I'm expressing an attitude of being against not holding doors for people. And there's nothing naturalistically spooky about that. We express attitudes all the time. We're constantly expressing things. So I basically have replaced this metaphysically, dubious claim about robust moral facts and reality with something that's naturalistically completely acceptable, the expression of attitudes. And
Okay, so you're basically saying you're not. I'm not positing that there is I don't know, external moral code that exists that tells us what are the good things and the bad thing. You're just saying I am adhering to one. I'm confused.
yeah, I'm expressing an attitude of being in favor of disapproving of certain actions and approving of others. So if I say murder is wrong, I'm expressing an attitude of being in favor of disapproving of murder. I think other people should disapprove of murder. But I'm not merely saying Josh Hunt disapproves of murder. That would be a kind of speaker subjectivism. So I'm not saying that. It's not a claim that I'm not positing robust truth conditions for the moral claim. I'm simply saying what the claim means is that so and so has expressed endorsement of norms that forbid certain behavior, require other behavior, permit some other behavior.
Okay, so you are basically outside uh, describing the claims without making a value judgment on whether there is a moral code behind the claim. I'm still, yeah, is that
Yeah,
correct?
yeah. So the part, and this is really crucial to avoiding getting embroiled in metaphysics. I'm not making some counter metaphysical claim about the nature of truth of moral judgments. I'm just being agnostic on whether or not there are robust moral facts in reality. I'm not saying there aren't. I'm not committing myself to their existence. If I were to deny that there are such moral facts in reality, I'd be
Yeah.
basically, falling victim to the same kind of observational difficulties that make
Right.
me skeptical of such things. I just don't have access to the moral realm if there is one. If there's a moral realm, I have just as little access to it as if there is no moral realm.
Okay.
So,
So you basically give up on discussing the moral realm. You just describe the fact that some people seem to be taking positions that seem to support that they have some value or another value.
in a way where you ultimately want to think this is a practice that is in good standing, it's a practice we should continue doing. There's other kinds of metaphysical anti-realist views which basically would ascribe error to people making moral judgments. So
Yeah, yeah,
people who
but
endorse.
let's continue on this
Mhm.
because I like to have at least a crystal clear idea on few on a small thing because otherwise what happens with philosophy a lot of the time, like even when I go through a paper, is that there are a lot of you, oh this is that, and then it becomes a sort of a whole amorphous thing, and I can never have a crystal, okay, this is done type of thing. So Okay, so let me repeat it and then see if I got it right, and then hammer me if I haven't. So the basic idea is this. Typically, when people talk about moral philosophy, they want to say that there is some kind of source of morality, and then they might debate, oh, this is how I do it, this is how I do it, this is where is the correct one. And so the idea is to be able to talk about morality without having chosen one of these things. You basically just saying, look, there are some people, and since I say I do not have access to what is the correct value of morality for everything, what I can still say, even if I don't have access to that, is the fact there are some people expressing some view in favor of some moral attachment to some behavior or not. Is that the idea?
That's the idea. And there's risks in characterizing the view such that you would think it basically becomes a kind of relativism. And so one thing that's helpful is on the expressivist framework, you are in position to basically mirror the language of the most robust realist. So at least when we're engaged in the practice of morality, or in the case of science, engaged in the practice of counterfactual reasoning, explanatory reasoning, reasoning using laws, the expressivist view, if done properly, will mirror the language of the most robust metaphysical realist in these kinds of contexts where you're using morality, using scientific reasoning. The only difference is kind of in these background philosophical contexts where you're not using the discourse you're analyzing, you're talking about it. So right now we're talking about morality, we're talking about laws of nature, we're in a detached context. In that context, you can ask me, hey, you sounded like a hardcore realist about morality, and you sounded like a hardcore realist about laws of nature. Are you actually? And I'll say, no, 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 I'm agnostic about whether or not there are robust corresponding facts in reality. But I think, these practices of reasoning are excellent for basically their instrumental value, and they should be condoned accordingly.
Yeah, you're going way too fast, Josh. Sorry, I need to go step by step. Okay, so so the trap, as you say, in fact, as I was also starting to be afraid, is that you don't want to become a relativist. You don't want to just say anything goes and whatever. So how exactly, you said at the end of the day, you're going to have a language that looks like you are a realist, but you're just not. But how do you get there? Like,
Yeah, this for me is always the thorniest problem facing someone like me trying to embark on this expressivist program. The solution that I find most compelling is to posit that the activity you're analyzing, morality, or in this case, science, has some kinds of background constitutive aims, such that if the activity weren't aiming at those things, it just would be a different activity. So in the case of science, if somebody presented me with an activity and said, these people just don't care about descriptive accuracy. They're going to say a lot of words, and whether or not those words actually track macro events, they don't really care. I'd say that's not science. And if you said to me, but these people, they're in science departments and they are getting grant funding, I'd say, doesn't matter. People are making a mistake. They're, delusional. That's not science. And it's could be a perfectly fine activity. I think there's a lot of activities that aren't aiming at descriptive accuracy. When you go to, the theater, typically the theater is not trying to make predictions about the future goings-on of the stock market, for instance. And I think that's no strike against the theater. It just has a different set of constitutive aims. But one of the constitutive aims of science is to make accurate predictions. And that's just a benchmark that you have to hold science up to. If you don't, you're not evaluating it as science. So once you've settled on some background constitutive aims, that's obviously going to be controversial, but I think anybody who's of the mindset that science makes progress some way, they're implicitly assuming there's some success criteria for science. And so
Josh,
you can,
wait a second. Double Digital, if you don't stop all this, we're here to listen to Josh and not you. So if you don't stop, I'll just remove you from the chat, okay? Thanks. Please go ahead.
yeah. So once you've settled on some background constitutive aims, then you're in position to evaluate these different norms, basically relative to how conducive they are to achieving those aims. So certain norms of counterfactual reasoning would just not be successful for the aim of predictive accuracy. If I thought, the following counterfactual is true. If I were to not be here right now, the Earth would have fallen into the sun. If I had systematically, bad counterfactual norms like that, I just wouldn't be successful at planning. Part of what helped me get here was, engaging in a process of planning where I thought about, if I were to leave at such and such time, would I get there on time? And if I, were to run these counterfactuals, and every time I thought, if I were to leave at 2 p.m., I would fall into the sun. I'm not going to be able to, effectively plan in a way that's actually in
Okay,
accordance with
so
reality.
let me go back and try to see if I understand it. So basically the idea is that it's essentially the constitutive rule of whatever game you are playing, if it's science, moral, philosophy, or whatever, that tells you what is acceptable discourse that makes sense in that context. And so you probably would have similar ideas, like if, for example, there was a requirement, an accepted requirement when you're doing moral philosophy that the morality has to be objective, then one that basically starts saying, well, I think it like this, I think it like this, without giving some, let's say, more grounded thing, grounded. More ground for their thinking, like more general. Then they would basically say, okay, well, that's not that you're saying that, but it doesn't adhere to the rule of moral philosophy, though, so it's essentially useless. So in the same way, in science, if you just start saying, oh yeah, there are. There are many things that we can't observe. Well, okay, but science has to be about things that we can interact with experimentally, so that's not science. So it's the rules of the game that define what is the good discourse within a certain realm, and changing realms, changing the rules of the game.
Yeah. So the analogy of games, I think, is very probative and illuminating. And so you can think of science as a kind of activity that has constitutive rules. And only by following those rules is one actually getting closer to successful science. And
Yeah.
in the end, you're not really ever going to maximally succeed at science. That's a kind of fun, thought experiment to wonder, what is the end of science, the end state that would be maximally successful? I have thought about that. But for the purposes of ruling out relativism, you just need there to be some constitutive success criteria. Then you can say certain norms of explanatory or counterfactual reasoning are bad.
Mhm.
And once you've been able to rule out even just a single set of norms, it's no longer anything goes relativism. You're not saying that it's anything
This is
goes.
great because this is how I've been approaching different fields anyway. I always thought, mathematics is a game. It has its rules, and you need to learn how to play. And a lot of the time is learning how to have successful discourse in a different discipline is understanding. Essentially, what the rules of the game are, what are the acceptable type of discourse, justification, reasoning, and what are not. And even, music and arts are games in the same way. The thing that I never was able to, and I think I said it in the other reading group, I never understood the rules of philosophy. Like if I think I would be able to like list the rules for math, for physics, and for music or whatever, but for philosophy, I still don't. So, could you try to tell me, let's see if it works, like if you were doing some type of philosophy, what would be some rules that you would have to follow that would make it philosophy? And what are the type of things that you can't do because otherwise it wouldn't be philosophy?
Great question. So I have a background project on the nature of philosophy. So this is separate from the stuff on explanation laws of nature. But almost all philosophical disputes, they ultimately boil down to disagreements about what's plausible. And people are essentially taking different bets on ways the world could be, such that one person thinks that way the world could be is very implausible. You should not bet on that. If you are, you're irrational. And other people think, no, that's totally fine. So for instance, in the context of laws of nature, someone who's a Humean about laws in the traditional sense, they ultimately posit brute regularities in reality. They just think reality is such that there are brute patterns that recur over the history of the universe, and there's nothing that lies behind these brute patterns. There's no governing laws, there's no laws of production, there's no necessary causal connections. Things just happen. And as a matter of brute fact, certain patterns occur. And the stable patterns are the ones that get codified as the laws. That's the Humean picture. Now, in a philosophical dispute, it's very common for someone to hear this picture and think, that is so implausible, that there would be regularities that have no underlying explanation. There must be some underlying explanation. People who think in this way, they're drawn toward various kinds of non-humanism. They're looking for some deeper explanation of the regularities in reality, and their minds revolt against the possibility that it could just be brute. They are deeply unsatisfied with this sort of possibility, and they think there must be a deeper answer. And someone of the initial cast of mind, they're just unpersuaded. They think, I mean, sure, maybe there could be a deeper thing, but there might not be. It might just be that, the way the world works is such and such facts are brute. So almost all philosophical disputes boil down to these kinds of disagreements about the way the world is, basically like different bets to take. And people use all kinds of language about if you think such and such, you're being irrational, or, the following is an unsatisfying explanation. But ultimately, on my view, it's just a kind of normative talk where we're essentially policing our reactive attitudes about what kinds of answers we should find satisfying. And there might be no ultimate fact of the matter on which of these sets of philosophical norms to endorse.
That's kind of how a lot of the philosophical discussion always felt to me, I have to say. Like, so I am very conscious of this. Like, whatever system of thought that you're gonna have, you are gonna have some, axiom, prerequisite, so you're some starting points, right? And again, you can't justify the starting points because otherwise you just have a different set of starting points. So those are essentially the thing that you have to choose because probably you find them implausible or plausible, as you were saying. And so at the end of the day, there is no escaping for there. And so a lot of the time, philosophy or rationality seems to me your best effort to justify things that are ultimately your personal pet peeve that you choose, that that you choose and you're not gonna be able to budge because those are your starting points. And one of the things that I like doing myself, I like to have those explicit in my head. What are the things that I am not going to change my mind, even having a preponderance of evidence, and then accept the fact that those are my starting points, and that's basically it. I don't think that more than that can be done. So you basically seem to saying, yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah, one way of putting it goes back at least to William James in his writings on pragmatism, where he noted there's different temperaments in philosophy. So often you can classify yourself as being in a certain school of thought. I'm in an empiricist school of thought, and in saying that I tell you something about my temperament, I tell you something about the kinds of claims that I find plausible, the kinds of claims I find implausible. And ultimately, on this kind of picture, there's just different families of temperaments, and based on the background assumptions you find plausible, you'll find certain philosophical accounts way more plausible or compelling than others. And there's not really anything else to do in philosophy than figure out what's the kind of picture that would satisfy me, given the things I'm puzzled by. And it's possible that you could be persuaded that you had made a mistake. So I think sometimes, fixing a temperament, you can initially think such and such picture is a satisfying one, and then learn of some problem you hadn't thought about before. I think this is how a lot of people feel about something like cultural relativism about morality. They initially think, oh, this is going to respect my naturalistic intuition, that moral facts are importantly different from empirical facts. Then you learn about all these downstream problems of cultural relativism. You're not in position to say, it would be wrong if somebody came into my office and robbed me right now. I wouldn't be able to say that. And you think that's kind of absurd. And so then you're like, oh man, actually, I shouldn't have been satisfied by cultural relativism. I need to think of a new view. You haven't changed anything about your temperament. You were just mistaken about the kind of position that would satisfy you. And then you ultimately learn about some more sophisticated moral theories. I think expressivism is one of them, where you basically get to have your cake, eat it too. And this kind of problem of, I can't sanction the person who tries to rob me goes away. I've preserved all the intuitions I thought were worth preserving, haven't run into any serious problems, nothing that bothers me, and I think I'm at peace. I feel
So
great.
how do you preserve the fact that you can send the person that will rob you in jail with expressivism?
Yeah, so I'm against what they're doing, and so when I say to them, "No, that's wrong. You can't rob me," I'm expressing acceptance of norms that forbid robbing people. And if somebody's like, "Well, on what basis do you do that?" I say these are the norms that are going to be more instrumentally useful for achieving cooperation, and I think part of what it is to live in a society is to have some shared cooperative goals. I think the only people who could not have these shared cooperative goals are people who exile themselves, people who are completely outside of society. I'm not worried about those people. If somebody completely outside of society wants to rob someone, they can't. It involves a contradiction. To rob someone, you have to enter society.
I understand, but how is this not choosing a type of moral philosophy? That is, the actions that are, that are productive
Hmm.
for society are justified. How is it
So
different?
ultimately, each person is going to endorse a more or less specific set of norms. Since we have finite minds, probably we're never actually going to have what's called a hyperplan. A hyperplan is a plan for every occasion. We don't have the cognitive capacities for that. But we
Right.
do more or less, start to approximate a set of norms that looks more utilitarian. Other people approximate norms that look more Kantian, a deontology theory. And on the expressivist picture, one is not saying there is necessarily a canonically correct set of norms. They're just saying certain sets of norms are bad and we can condemn them for not being conducive to the background constitutive aims of having moral thinking at all. And the ultimate best thing for society, for agents like us, could be pluralism. The ultimate best thing could be that an agent
I
like me, the norms I
agree.
endorse are slightly different than some other norms, and we're basically in some kind of picture that evolutionary game theorists talk about, where there's just a
Right.
stable equilibrium of different strategies, and it's actually for the best for the population that there are these different groups of different strategies.
Okay, so I'm still trying to wrap my hand around this because at the end of the day, so it seems that then the strategy is a lot more localized. Like you're not trying to you're you don't need to have well, it seems to me that it's different is that you don't need a universal idea of morality to be able to talk about morality. Well, if I basically say, like in the other picture where I want to say, oh, where does morality come from? Well, I need to tell you what is it. So it's God, it's whatever other idea that I put forward. And then now that idea has to be absolute, and then I have to have a complete consistency among all the things that I spout about morality. And this is not going to happen anyway. And you're going to be in a big mess. Or you can basically say, look, I can try to, if you are an expressive and then you say, well, I don't need to have this gigantic thing, all self-consistent to be able to talk about morality, which I'm not going to have anyway. Maybe there is, maybe there is, but it's not accessible to me because I'm a stupid human being and therefore I'm never going to get it. I can still talk about these things in these circumstances and express the fact that in this condition, I think this is the moral thing to do. And then there's going to be other people that, of course, feel it very differently. And then you have this haggling and so on. So that's basically more or less the idea, which it kind of, it's more descriptive of what happens anyway than.
Yeah, one thing I like about the picture is that it allows for this kind of pluralism without positing contradictions in reality. So in the case of explanation, if
Okay.
you were a descriptivist about explanatory relevance, you thought claims of explanatory relevance are necessarily tracking relations in reality, well then it seems you're forced to choose about what are the kinds of things that are explanatorily relevant. Are they causal claims? Are they claims about laws of nature? Are they statistical claims? Are they sometimes non-causal claims that have to do with mathematical facts? Are they claims about grounding? And if you don't make a choice, it seems like you just haven't given an account of explanation. But if you're a descriptivist and you think these relevance relations are tracking things in reality, well, then it seems you just haven't given an account. And if you were to try to be a pluralist on that picture, then you're very quickly embroiled in basically positing reality is one way. Oh, and also reality is this other way that's contradictory. You'd be saying things like, causes are the things that are explanatory relevant and never laws. Oh yeah, but laws are also explanatory relevant and not causes. And that would be a contradiction. Where on the expressivist picture, I'm just looking out to see how scientists actually reason in a way that is conducive to the aim of prediction and describing observable phenomena. And if some pocket of scientists is predominantly using causal talk and downplaying talk about laws, I think, cool, they're doing a good job. And if some other community is downplaying causal talk, but thinking about laws, great. There could be multiple kinds of norms that are instrumentally valuable for the constitutive aims of science, such that I, the expressivist, don't have to choose. I don't have to make a choice. I don't have to think, oh, they're positing rival ontologies, and at most one of them could be correct, and it's not empirically accessible which one, and we have to appeal to super empirical virtues, figure out which one's simpler or more fruitful. I don't have to do any of that. And so that to me is very attractive of the picture.
So is this the issue why then people essentially espouse one stance of realism, empirism, and so on, is to find the one true level of explanation that works for everything? Is that what they're looking for?
Yeah, so in almost every dispute in philosophy, and also in the philosophy of science, there are empirically unobservable posits that people disagree about. And because they're not observable, we don't have a way of testing
Can
to
you make
see.
again examples?
Yeah, so there's a classic debate in philosophy of science over explanation where some people think to give an explanation, you have to cite a law of nature. And if you haven't cited a relevant law of nature, you haven't explained the phenomena. Other people think, nope, you don't have to cite laws. Laws actually aren't directly explanatorily relevant. What's relevant is causes and sometimes the grounds of things. And that's all you have to cite. These two people, these different camps, they're positing different claims about what sorts of events in reality are explanatorily relevant, what sorts of facts are explanatorily relevant. We don't have measurement devices to settle this dispute. This is not something that is empirically accessible. The way this gets adjudicated is by the philosophers. You write out both philosophical theories and you ask questions about which one seems more virtuous along various dimensions. Unified, simpler, avoids puzzling explanatory claims. But as we were talking about before, many of these alleged, puzzling explanatory claims are the kinds of things that people can reasonably disagree about. And one person can think, no, that's not a thing to be puzzled by. And another person's like, oh, this view just has this intolerable feature. It posits such and such as a brute fact. There must be some further explanation for that. And you're like, you're just never going to get to the bottom of this kind of thing. And, I think a lot of philosophers, this is most of what philosophers do, is trying to get to the bottom of the stuff. And I think ultimately it's instrumentally valuable for helping people figure out what kind of picture of reality would lead them to peace. So I'm very much pro-philosophy, and I think it's great. But I do think philosophers are often overly optimistic about that they're actually going to get to the bottom of this kind of thing, which is not, at least I'm
This
skeptical.
explains so many interactions that I had with philosophers, I have to say. So there was this guy that you probably also know. After a talk, he was discussing something. I think it was about the nature, the fact that in quantum mechanics you have two different particles. You have the ones that occupy the same state and then the one that does. No? And so he gave this talk. I don't understand. I sort of went back to him afterwards, but this is just a simple theorem. If you posit that there is the Hilbert space, then you do this mathematically, you can prove it. And yeah, but that's not like he wasn't satisfied by that, and I could understand what. I mean, he seemed to accept the fact that the states. So he seemed to expect the mathematical framework of quantum mechanics, and that was just a simple consequence of the mathematical framework. So I don't. And it seems to me like, as one you said, like somehow that type of explanation did not jive with him, and he was looking for something else. But I don't. Okay. So this is quite frankly illuminating. Like, as you know, I've been interacting with philosophers for like a decade now, and I am I have been saying right now only. There are some things that you're putting together for me that are very helpful. Okay, so so you're basically saying that all these people, what they're trying to do is to create this one single thing that basically tells us why. Again, but it's really just an account of explanation. There's nothing else that they're trying to get at.
Well, they're trying to figure out the way the world is. They're trying to figure out the fundamental nature of reality. It's very similar to the different interpretations of non-relativistic quantum mechanics. We have these different theories that more or less make the same predictions. At most, one of them could track the way the world is, and you want to know. So that's, basically what the philosophers are doing in the various parts of philosophy. They have these theories that posit rival ontologies, and they want to figure out which of these ontologies should I believe. Someone like me, I'm not able to give them an answer to that question, which of these ontologies should you believe? Because I say, I'm going to be agnostic. I don't know. And my goal is just to take a given practice that I think is good, one that should continue and be improved, like counterfactual reasoning in science, reasoning in terms of laws of nature, giving explanations in science. I think all of that is incredibly useful for the scientific enterprise, and it's stuff that we should stick around. And I want to vindicate it, but I don't want to vindicate it in the normal way of positing some backing ontology, because when you go that route, you then get embroiled in all these metaphysical problems and issues of epistemic access. And so the puzzle is, how does one vindicate this sort of reasoning where the reasoning, in its superficial syntactic structure seems to embroil you in metaphysics, but
Right, so
vindicate in a way, yeah.
let me get this because there seems to be a contradiction there. Uh, so I would think that even the philosophers that are interested in metaphysics and this ontological question, they are still going to recognize that science can only tell you about things that are empirically accessible.
But part of what's in question is what counts as empirically accessible. So do you need to see something with, your naked senses for it to be empirically accessible?
Well,
Is
there
it
has to
enough
be
that there's
a
some
chain of evidence that I can link with causation. So yes, I don't see, I don't know, the particle, but I have a detector, and then I construct a chain of inference from what happens in the detector to the result that I have when I take the data.
if somebody posits Occam's razor and they think, other things equal, the theory that commits you to fewer kinds of entities is more likely to be true. And then you're confronted with two rival theories, one of which is committed to three fewer kinds of entities than the other. You apply Occam's razor. Is that evidence that the simpler theory is more likely to be true?
No, but if I posit, let's say, hidden variables that are automatically, by definition, things that we're never going to be able to measure, you already, by definition, you said, I'm talking about things of which I'm never going to have experimental evidence. I'm talking about, parallel universes and so on. Same thing. So this is what I really, really don't understand, because to me, those things, by definition, they're not science. And it's fine that you want to, go and talk about those things and you create your philosophy or religion or whatever you want to based on these things. But to me, it's not science in the sense that it's not experimentally accessible. So why would you think that learning about science is going to help you solve some questions that are by definition outside the realm of science?
I think that the philosopher of science, faced with this kind of puzzle, they're hoping that science at least cuts down on the options that are plausible. So if part of your goal is to understand the nature of causal connections in reality, you think independently of science, there's a vast number of metaphysical possibilities. If you're naturalistically inclined, you think science by and large is tracking reality, and by learning relevant parts of science, you've dramatically shrunk the search space. You started with massive number of metaphysical possibilities. Science ruled out a lot of them. Then the remaining puzzle is, okay, the scientific theories, they don't give further empirical distinctions between various philosophical rival notions of causation. At that point, you're left with these super empirical virtues, the context being basically the same as that confronting the foundations of physicist who wants to know what is the nature of quantum mechanical reality.
Okay, so let me give you an argument of how that simplistically doesn't work. So one of the things that we show as part of the project, right, is that the thing that we are accessible, right, can have to be at most identified by a countable sequence of experimental questions that are yes or no, so of a verifiable state. Okay, so if you run the math, of course, then each object has to be identified by a sequence of this bits essentially, but 0, 1 that it has to be countable, and therefore you can distinguish up to the cardinality of the continuum, right? That's as much as you can. But there is no reason why the underlying reality, right, would be made of things that are of cardinality bigger than that, right? What we would see is just the quotient space of reality with whatever we want to say, right? And so it is possible, entirely possible, that the cardinality of the possible universe, whatever, is Aleph 15, right? And we are not going to even have mathematical tools to be able to explore that space. But I see no philosopher trying to posit that those are the real thing, because they say, okay, I'll look at the of what science gives you, but what science gives you can only be a very limited view of what the reality would be.
I think part of the here I'm playing devil's advocate for the traditional philosopher.
Yep.
As you know, my own view is much more receptive to yours. But in playing devil's advocate, the thought is something like in science we already have a problem of underdetermination of theory by evidence, where given a finite observation set, there is in principle an infinite number of theories that would reproduce, that would basically make the retrodictions that that's what you would have saw, that's the data you would have gotten. And what do we do when we have issues of underdetermination? You ultimately pick about how to proceed and you write down a theory. And the reasons you pick could be pretty idiosyncratic, historically contingent. The aspects of it that seem intersubjective, if anything, is intersubjective here, is principles that most agents think are theoretical virtues, things like fruitfulness, simplicity, unification.
Right, but I still think that those are the things that were successful for the type of things that we do in science. And we selected those strategies because they were fruitful to find the things that we do in science. So, for example, in science, we look for, especially in physics, you look for simple things that you can manipulate and you can access, right? And that already gives you a self-selection toward the simplicity and all of that, right? And but at the end of the day, it's a self-selection. So yeah, yeah, that's essentially I don't buy it. But okay, fine. You probably would agree anyway. So there's no point. Yeah.
Yeah, I
So
mean, I just think, I'm very much receptive to the mindset of the traditional philosopher and philosopher of science, where they think science is getting you close to the nature of reality. And even when science has sorted out its underdetermination problems, you still have all these further underdetermination problems where imagine you're a hardcore realist about laws of nature. You think there are these things, laws of nature. The scientific theories don't tell me the relevant metaphysics. That's something that there's just, on the table, I don't know, at least 10 rival metaphysical hypotheses that would reproduce everything that we observe, everything that the scientists do with their law of nature concept. And you want to figure out what laws really are. And science is let up at a certain point, and the only thing that's left seems to be this process of applying theoretical virtues and adjudicating these competing accounts and making choices about what kinds of answers are satisfactory. I mean, that's the
I understand it. That to me is with the problem of what that really are means, because at the end of the day, I mean, in science, we create models for a system that we study, and those are always approximation, and you have the same model that study different systems. This is also why I can't understand how people take very, very literally, for example, quantum mechanics, while the same math can describe a single electron, a proton, an atom, a molecule, like you use the same formalism, the same model for describing different things at different level of composition. How could you think that that in some way is a fundamental thing? It is just a model that works well in some conditions, and I don't see that it can be more true in any of the case. So I don't understand how you can justify that you take it to be more true when you're studying electron, but then you're okay to say, oh yes, it's just an approximation when I'm talking about molecules or atoms. I just don't get that.
Well, even putting aside the issue of approximate truth, presumably you would grant that there is some fact of the matter about whether or not any given interpretation of quantum mechanics is correct. Now, if you think all the interpretations on the table are approximations and thereby are false, then someone could still come along and say, well, in principle, we could write down an interpretation of quantum mechanics that is true. It would just match the way the world is. Presumably, you, Gabrielle, think there is some way the world is. The true theory is the one that tracks the way the world
I
is.
don't think that it's fruitful. I don't think that's the right approach. I'm more and more convinced that the type of, and this would be a whole other video, which might do another discussion another time. But I do think that there is like a certain misconception in that, again, it's the problem of giving some ontological status to systems instead of saying, well, a system is just something that I can produce in certain circumstances. There's going to be a boundary. Something's going to happen at the boundary. And therefore, it's not that when I study a quantum system, I'm not studying just the part of the universe that I call an electron. I'm also studying it in relation with a certain boundary that I've put between that system and everything else. And so giving too much of a standalone ontological status, whatever you want to say, on a quantum system, I think is the problem. So this actually is a metaphysical question that so for the long time, I thought I was not interested in metaphysics because metaphysics is about more these things that exist independently of what we do and so on. Then I had the pleasure to talk to Olympia, but I don't remember her last
Oh,
name.
Lombardi?
Exactly, Olympia Lombardi. And she's let's say a metaphysical pluralist in the same way that you do with expressivism for the idea. It basically says, yeah, no, the metaphysics is about the system that we construct, and so you're going to have the system at different level, and they have different status. And when she talks about the connection between thermodynamics and statistical mechanics in gas theory, in the theory of kinetic theory of gas, she says those are two different theories. Like you have some concepts that are defined like the average kinetic energy for molecules. That's one theory, that's one thing. And it's sort of metaphysically separate from the fact that you have thermodynamics with entropy and temperature and so on. And then you have an equation that connects the two. And she says the right way of thinking about this is not saying that the whole thermodynamics, all that metaphysics just goes away because you only have the theory of gas. No, you have two different things and you are connecting them. And so that type of a way of calling it metaphysics, though I only saw her calling it metaphysics and other people, not the general people side. So that sort of is more appealing to me because it sort of recognizes that whatever we are calling system at the different level has completely different set of circumstances. And so if you buy into that, then which is what I do because it seems the more practical thing of how science works, then the question of what is the right fundamental ontology for quantum particles vanishes because it says, okay, that it doesn't apply anymore. Does it make
But it would
sense?
even this way of thinking, I mean, this is the kind of funny thing when I talk to someone like you who's opposed to metaphysics. in this kind of discussion, you're appealing to cases where metaphysical theorizing was fruitful for science. And someone like you should be able to grant the instrumental value of that theorizing, even here where you're saying, yeah, I want to endorse the kind of pluralism where people get to think of different models. Who cares if some of the people, what motivates them to think of these different models is that they take them really seriously. And what gets them out of bed in the morning is they think, today might be the day I figure out the way the world works. If
Hmm.
that's what gets some people going, just let them be motivated that way. And they're going to do the thing that you're condoning. They're going to think of these different models. They might say some stuff that you find annoying, but so be it. I'm sure you're saying a lot of stuff that they would find annoying, and you guys just happily coexist. And, that's, I think, overall for the best. So there's people like you who are baseline skeptical of taking certain kinds of metaphysical posits seriously. There's other people who are not skeptical at all, and in virtue of that, it inspires them to have certain kinds of imaginative ideas that someone like you might be less likely to have.
I agree up to the point where the debates on the foundation of quantum mechanics and the foundation of quantum physics have been dominated for the past 50 years on only their camp and to the point that there is very little space for the rest. I mean, that's my problem. It's Right. So the issue is that I need to do some things, both at the math level and the philosophy level and the physics level, to sort of make some of these things gels. And the fact that the sort of the debate on the foundation of quantum mechanics is basically interpretations, which turns off the vast majority of people that would like to have something along the line that I'm doing, it basically makes it so that whenever I say I'm doing quantum foundation or I'm doing foundations of physics, I get put in a box where, oh yeah, that's not interesting to me. And I think that's basically created a void that has sort of being perpetually open and funding agencies are not funding these things because they don't see it fruitful, because it says, okay, this is just a metaphysical mumbo jumbo, we're not going to care. And so that's my practical concern. Like in principle, yeah, I don't care what other people think as long as I
Hmm.
can do my thing. The problem is that as long as I can do my thing.
Yeah, no, I think those are fair points, yeah, at the sociological level.
Yeah, the sociological level, yes, it's not the conceptual level. Yes. Okay, so this was very useful. Let me see. Is there anything that you want to say specifically about expressivism that we haven't covered in terms of explanations and all that?
Oh, I mean, I haven't actually gone into any specific details about how the proposals work, but that's fine,
That's
And
what I
so,
figured. So
yeah,
let's
yeah,
do
yeah.
it. Let's do it.
Oh, okay. So, ultimately, the view I come to about explanation is when someone says that such and such answer is explanatory, they're expressing acceptance of norms that permit being satisfied by that answer. So if I ask you, why is the sky blue? And you say, the sky's blue because I feel like it, and I say, that's not an explanation. In saying that's not an explanation, I've expressed norms that forbid me being satisfied, forbid anybody being satisfied by the answer, the sky's blue because Gabrielle, wanted the sky to be blue. That's nonsense. Um, so, the whole goal is just to give a story where you can vindicate the actual norms of intellectual satisfaction that guides scientific reasoning. The contention being that only certain norms would actually be conducive to empirical adequacy and predictive success and control of subsystems.
So are
So
you
that's the.
able
Mhm.
to formulate what are these norms?
Oh, so that's a good question. I think it ultimately kind of backpedals into stuff about causation and laws, insofar as most of the forms of explanation ultimately appeal to something like causation or laws of nature or statistical regularities. So at that point, I'm kind of flung back into these puzzles about what is the nature of reasoning in terms of laws, and then I have a story of counterfactuals where then I think ultimately the rock bottom is something like, what are the norms of causal reasoning? What are the norms of counterfactual reasoning? And those are the ones that are conducive to, the explanations that we endorse as satisfying.
Okay, so it's basically again the norms are the good norms are the one that are productive to get to the thing that you want of doing for science. That's basically the idea.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, for example, Occam razor would be a good norm because if I have a simpler explanation, I can make more sense of them and I can get nicer laws, and therefore it's more productive.
Well, I think Occam's razor is a kind of norm operating at a different level. It's a norm of theory choice. It's relevant when you're choosing between putatively rival theories.
Are you aware of the work of Kevin Kelly that shows instead that the what's it called? The Occam's razor, it's like the logical progression to find the correct theory.
Well, that's what I mean. It's operating at the level of theory choice, which I think is when one's giving an explanation, they already have in mind a background theory, typically, that they've endorsed. When I
Okay, probably I
tell
wouldn't
you,
just wouldn't use the word choice, I guess, at that point.
yeah, you're not in a, when somebody says the reason the sky is blue is the dominant wavelength reflected by water droplets in the atmosphere during the day is around 450 nanometers. They're, presuppose some background theory about correlation between wavelengths and colors, optics. So we're not choosing between theories in that context. We're appealing to a theory, applying it.
Right. Okay. Should we see if there are questions from the chat then? It seems it's been an hour. Does anybody have questions? Let's see if we're. The atom is a question. Okay, so I don't see specific questions. If anybody has specific questions, please make them. I don't know. Is there anything else you think would be useful to add at this point, Josh?
Oh, I think for the purposes of your project, Gabrielle, it's always struck me that whenever one is confronted with a seeming metaphysical choice, you could just say it's the kind of thing you could be agnostic about. So you give the formalism, and if somebody's like, hey, your formalism appeals to, such and such claims about forces. What do you think the ontology of forces is? Is it, option A, B, or C, and they're rivals? You say, hey,
Yeah.
listen, yeah, if those options, all support the same predictions,
Yeah.
then it's not the kind of thing you have to choose.
Yeah. Now, but it's the same thing with interpretation of quantum mechanics. Everything we want to do has to be interpretation independent, but even the type of concept that we want to have in the basic theory has to be even independent between classical mechanics, quantum mechanics, and so on. So everything has to be, yeah, there are states. What are states? So this is the correct characterization for all of them. They have this property, and that's it.
Hmm.
And whatever happens underneath, what's really happen. But the thing that is puzzling to me is that while we're doing that work with a minimal set of assumption, we actually recover the full theory. And so at that point, you say, okay, well, if all the full theory can be recovered with this minimal set of assumption, where it's telling you nothing about what goes on underneath, what the interpretations are, and so on, then there is absolutely no need to like you shouldn't be puzzled by the fact that quantum mechanics has these properties because these properties are fully justified by this set of requirements or assumptions that you've put in. So
Hmm.
right, that's
Yeah,
basically the
yeah,
goal.
yeah,
And
yeah.
but of course, I know that people are not gonna still not gonna be satisfied
Hmm.
because, as you
Yeah,
said,
yeah.
they want something more. But then I can just say, look, I don't care about having the something more. Just to be able to say that from here I can get to there, I get everything that sort of satisfies me. So,
Hmm.
but that
Yeah,
was
yeah.
really clear for me, 10 years ago when I embarked in this crazy stuff. I mean, that's what I want. I don't want anything more. And I think anything more would actually create problems. It would not solve anything because then I have this extra stuff that I don't know where to put. So.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I think the bone that I'm willing to throw to the metaphysically inclined is sure, there could be one of these options that actually is the correct one, and maybe you could end up believing it, and bonus points for you. The only thing I'm against is someone trying to convince me that I shouldn't be satisfied until I myself
Yeah, yeah,
come to
exactly.
that.
Agreed.
That's the claim. It's like I'm never arguing that people who are metaphysically inclined shouldn't be searching for answers in the way they are. I think they're doing a great job relative to their ambitions and what would satisfy them. The thing that I'm against is someone trying to impute upon me that I'm irrational if I'm not searching for the same thing. That's what
I
I'm
vehemently
against.
agree, and I think this is the part that sort of stifled the debate because the people like us that were sort of, oh yeah, those are not thinking clearly. They're not really thinking clear enough because they're not, worried about these problems that I don't think are a problem. So yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. Hard work. It feels we're going to have different scientific understanding based on our metaphysics. It tries you might to act like we can simply do methodological naturalism for the sake of empirical work.
Oh, I definitely think at a certain level of fine graining, if you thought you only have adequate understanding if you know the correct metaphysics for laws of nature, then of course only someone who had gone deep into the metaphysics of laws and happened upon the correct theory of laws would have that understanding. For the purposes of vindicating the notion of understanding in science, it's not necessary to settle upon that metaphysics for the reason that the scientists themselves, by and large, are ignorant of these background debates in the metaphysics of science about laws of nature. So if my goal is to vindicate what scientists mean by understanding, and the scientists themselves aren't drawing these background, more fine-grained philosophical distinctions, then there's just no need for me to settle upon the correct ontology for metaphysics of laws.
Basically, if the scientists are doing their science and are not worrying about these problems, then
It's not something that I have to make a choice about
yeah, exactly.
for my purposes. Yeah, I definitely think if somebody thought the thing I want to make sense of is understanding where you only have understanding or only have adequate understanding insofar as you have no false beliefs and everything is maximally precisified, then yeah, for that you'd have to take some gambles on the metaphysics of laws, but that's not what I'm trying to do. So, power to somebody who's trying to do that. Like you, Gabrielle, I think ultimately that kind of project is hopeless on epistemic grounds. You're never going to find out what the true account of the metaphysics of laws is, but God bless. So
Yeah, and again, I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with religion. Somebody has their own religion positions and so on. As long as they don't come saying, "Oh yeah, I can prove empirically that God exists," or "I can disprove empirically that God exists." As long as you don't make those claims that are apparently false and anti-scientific, I'm absolutely fine. You can believe, and there are going to be some other reason why, for example, some system of beliefs are better for society or not. There is a whole different thing. But again, it has nothing to do with science. It's as I said, it's like peas and carrots shouldn't be touching. There are two different aspects of and discourse or truth, if you want to call it truth. So. Okay, so I think that was fun. I don't see any other questions, so we'll just end the stream here. Thank you,
cool.
everybody.
Yeah.
And
Thanks so much,
if you
Gabrielle.
guys thought that this was useful and you want to repeat it, leave a comment. And if you have topics that we should talk about, maybe that could also be useful. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
See you next time. There we go.